let's get started. Thank you so much for having me. Today I chose a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I think something that, I don't think any of the information that I'm going to present this morning is going to necessarily be new information. However, I think that the framing of it and the context is what's going to really bring some meaning to this, right? So I'm going to take a moment to really point out, we're going to look at Louisiana Jewish foodways, so how Louisiana foodways and Jewish foodways intersect. And a lot of the things might be things that seem very normal to us living in New Orleans. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I was really surprised to encounter some very different types of Jewish foods in New Orleans and in Southern Louisiana overall. So we're going to really point out the peculiarities, the idiosyncrasies of Louisiana Jewish foodways, and then more broadly consider what it reveals about the uniqueness of this community. So just, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Everyone see the slide? Wonderful. So just as a little background, this actually started as a project that I did for a Jewish food ethics class that I took in rabbinical school. And I wanted to do a project on Southern Jewish foodways and as a means of analyzing larger sociological phenomena. So what I ultimately created was kind of like a calendar that reflected the importance of time and seasons of foodways and the intersection of the rhythm of the Louisiana seasonal calendar with the Jewish calendar. Time is a really important influence on the food that we can consume on any given day. It affects our dietary habits. The weather affects what kind of crops we grow, whether we want to try and cool down or warm up, get excited or calm down. And seasons also determine holidays, festivals, and communal gatherings, which each have their own specific foodways, not only in the New Orleans calendar, but also in the Jewish calendar. And Louisiana food in particular is deeply tied to the idea of seasons and time. So what's an example of some time-specific foods in New Orleans or Southern Louisiana overall?
Aside from crawfish?
Crawfish, yeah. Well, crawfish is a great example, right? I know when my parents came down in August, September, I don't know, they came down at some point where it was not crawfish season and all they wanted was crawfish. And they were like, oh, we're looking around for crawfish. And we were like, no, sorry, right? Like if you're from outside of Louisiana, you think like, oh, there's just always crawfish, right? Because there's always crawfish at buffet on the menu. So it must be fresh, right? Yeah, that's a great one. What else? What's another seasonal food?
King cake.
King cake, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? So we're thinking that like crawfish and king cake, we're thinking seasonally. Can we think about other, what was that?
Thanksgiving. Well, she's in New Orleans. Yeah, well, turkey, yeah. New Orleans.
What was that, Rachel?
I said oysters.
Oysters, yeah.
Nothing that's kosher or Jewish.
Well, but that's what we're going to look at is in what ways and how the Jewish community encountered those traditions and found ways of incorporating them into Jewish foods, whether by kind of shirking the treif rules, by shirking kosher and finding substitutes, or by really blending two different cultures, right? Another example that comes to mind for me is red beans and rice on Mondays, right? That's very much a Louisiana tradition. And seasons and time play an integral role also in the foodways of the Jewish calendar. So the crops of the harvest for Sukkot, we just celebrated Tu B'Shvat, where we're consuming all of these different fruits and things like and wheat and barley and things that are also seasonal. The darkness of Hanukkah.
The parsha where they fight over the Jacob and Esau fight over the birthright. Isn't that when you eat lentils?
Oh, they do. It is. So Jacob and Esau. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Some people do that, but that would be cool to do that on like the Monday on a Monday when we read that Parsha to kind of combine the Jewish and the Louisianan traditions, right? That it's a bowl of lentils that he ultimately eats, that Esau eats in order to and gives away his birthright in its stead. So, you know, the Jewish calendar also very much helps us to figure out what we should be eating and vice versa. And so the calendar that I created seeks to illustrate how for Southern Jews, the Louisianan calendar and the Jewish calendar interact with one another through the vehicle of food. So I want to start with an overarching idea to kind of guide where we're going this morning. So Nick Spitzer, who's a sociologist, has coined this phrase Mond Creole, which is like he defines it as a small world that maintains a strong local identity as it interacts with other small worlds, creolizing from within and in relation to one another on local, regional, national, and global levels, right? So Creole, of course, is, you know, the name for a specific ethnicity of individuals, right? But it comes from this idea of a blending and mixing of a variety of backgrounds. And here, what Nick Spitzer is doing is taking that idea and building it out a bit to use it as an organizing principle or a framework to understand a lot of other sociological phenomenon, specifically in the South. So I didn't put in the whole calendar for us this morning, but I'm gonna organize it by seasons, and you'll see some of the seasons are like our normal seasons, some are a little bit more New Orleans oriented, but we're gonna start with the fall. And what I chose to represent the fall was cookbooks. So is anyone familiar with this cookbook?
Yes.
Rachel?
Mildred was a member of our group for many, many years.
Oh, really? Oh, amazing. So I am probably going to just absolutely slaughter all of this, but I'm going to do my best. So, right, so here we have a kosher Creole cookbook, right? So since the beginning of the 20th century, cookbooks published by synagogues and Jewish families have illustrated how Creole, Cajun, African American, and Jewish traditions have informed and influenced one another. And so Mildred Cover and Sylvia Gerson asked in the introduction to this cookbook, how is it possible to be a kosher cook and a Creole cook at the same time? Especially since many of the famous Creole recipes include such basic ingredients as seafood and pork for seasoning and involve the combination of milk and meat products. So, right, that's kind of what you were getting at in the beginning, Rachel, of like, you know, oysters and crawfish are these very seasonal, very deeply identified with Southern Louisiana dishes. What do we do as Jewish people who have, you know, our own dietary restrictions and expectations? How do those two worlds interact with one another? And the entire project of this cookbook reflects the clear dedication of observant Louisianan Jews to both Louisiana and Jewish identities, undergirded by a desire to find harmony between the two. So this cookbook is organized by month, beginning with September as a reflection of the beginning of the Jewish New Year and the commemoration of the creation of the world, right? So Rosh Hashanah is Hakarat HaOlam, the creation of the world. And the September section of Kosher Creole outlines traditional Kosher Creole Yom Tov meals, right? So high holiday meals, essentially. And the recipes in this section include some traditional recipes like challah, and as well as kosher versions of popular Creole cuisine. For example, there's a recipe for chicken okra gumbo with a sausage, which substitutes kosher smoked sausages and gizzards for treif meat, right? So that's an example of a time when, you know, a common Creole food is being reimagined by substituting things that fit into the Jewish paradigm of what is kosher, right? What is fit to eat. So the recipes combine Creole and Cajun flavors within the restrictions of the laws of kashrut. Co-authored by a Jew and a native Creole New Orleanian, the syncretic recipes of kosher Creole emerge authentically and cooperatively. And so you can even see that in the cover of the cookbook itself, right? So we have here a colorful image of Creole and Jewish food featuring an Orthodox man, right? A very stereotypically looking Orthodox man with a black hat, right? Playing a shofar, and tzitzit, right? Shadowed by, and then, facing him is an African-American man playing the trumpet, right? So demonstrating the way that Colbert and Gerson embrace these two cultures and consciously and openly knit them together without losing the identity of one or the other. Any questions so far? Okay. If anything I'm saying doesn't make sense, or you disagree, or you have a question, just, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I would, especially because we're such a small group.
To share.
What was that?
I said, or if you have a great recipe to share.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll move on to winter. So what is a Jewish winter dish?
Brisket.
Why brisket?
I don't know. It's heavy.
Heavy. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I hadn't thought about this before, but I shop at Trader Joe's because it's one of the few places that you can get fresh kosher meat in the greater New Orleans area. And right before Hanukkah, my partner and I went and we saw that they had brisket. They had kosher brisket. And we looked at each other and it wasn't on our list and we hadn't been planning on making brisket. And we're like, oh no, it's okay. We'll wait and we'll go and we'll get it next week. I come back a week later and there's no brisket, right?
Sure.
Like a week later. And I asked the people at Trader Joe's, I say, like, what happened to the brisket? And they said, oh, well, we only get it specifically around Jewish holidays. So they literally only had it for the week of Hanukkah. So like with tears in my eyes, they said, wait, so I have to wait until Passover? Right? But it's interesting the way that, for us, brisket is something special, right? You're not gonna have brisket every day.
No.
But it isn't necessarily like only in the winter or only in the, right? It's not something that we only have at holidays. You could have it at other times. Or you just think about the fact that, like, as Jews, we have a holiday once a week, right? We have Shabbat every single Friday. But from the perspective of Trader Joe's, right, their understanding of Jewish seasonal foods is that you have brisket at the Jewish holidays, and not a week before, not a day after. That's it, right? What other winter holiday foods in the Jewish tradition would we encounter?
Latkes.
Latkes, yeah.
Well, yeah.
And with latkes, what's our counterpart to latkes?
Applesauce.
Applesauce, yes.
Kashavanishkas.
Kashavanishkas.
Matzo ball soup because it's cold.
Mm-hmm. and sufganiyot.
Gefilte fish.
Gefilte fish, I think of more as Passover, but you could have gefilte fish anytime, as the jar of gefilte fish that's been sitting in my fridge since last Passover would attest. But also sufganiyot, right? Latkes and sufganiyot is like that oily base, right? That reminds us of the oil from the miracle of the oil in the temple.
Right.
So has anyone? So the dish, the Louisiana dish that I chose for winter was beignets, right? So Louisiana obviously has no shortage of oily foods. And the beignet, right, which is so ingrained in New Orleans and in Louisiana, in many ways is really just a sufganiyah, right? It is a fried dough. It's oily, it's sweet, it's delicious. And so the beignet offers a natural way to marry Southern foodways with Jewish foodways. So in a Kveller article, there's this great quote from an author named Peter Pelia. And he says, after all, beignets are fried and Jews eat fried food on Hanukkah. It was a perfect match.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Have y'all ever had you couldn't find sufganiyot and so you went with beignets instead?
Because in Israel they do donuts, right?
Yeah, so sorry, sufganiyah is a donut. Mm-hmm. Sufganiyot are usually they're like stuffed with something, or yeah, it's incredible to see in Jerusalem around around Hanukkah time, all of a sudden there's these like beautiful donuts everywhere. I ate way too many donuts when I was living in Israel around Hanukkah. But have you ever done that where you're like, oh, I remember this year someone reached out to me and said like, oh, what's the best place to get sufganiyot in New Orleans? And I'm like,
Agent.
morning call, right? Like,
Right.
A beignet is going to be better than any donut that you find around here, I think.
Tell me where it is.
It's like you've yet to make a good bagel.
Oh, don't get me, as a Jew from New Jersey, don't get me started on bagels.
Well,
down
we're
here.
Jewish. We're Jews from New York. Disgusting bagels.
It's,
They have not figured that one out here.
nope. I don't know if they ever will, but it's okay. We'll forgive them. We will forgive New Orleans because there's so much other good food, you know.
That is true. That's true.
Mhm.
The thing.
So the next meal that I chose was red beans and rice. So, you know, not necessarily specifically a winter food, but you know, it's something that's filling. It provides a warm, good meal for winter. But also I felt so this was what I used for the month of January, because I felt like January is kind of the Monday of the Gregorian calendar, right? It's like the first day. It's the beginning. And so obviously, you know, eating red beans and rice on Monday is a tradition in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana, and is very much like a civic ritual, right? I mean, the fact that there is a book that's called Today is Monday in Louisiana, and it's about eating red beans and rice on Mondays, says a lot about the role of this culinary ritual, right? Because that's really what it is. It's a ritual. It's a ritual that came out of a very basic need, right? That on Mondays was laundry day, and so you didn't have a lot of time to be cooking food, so you could just throw a bunch of things in a pot, and then you had food for the day, right?
Right.
And so, even though it started in this kind of very utilitarian manner, it has come to take on almost spiritual connotations, right? It has deep resonances with the people of New Orleans. And red beans and rice reaches far back into New Orleans history. And in fact, this dish appears in local writings from the late 18th century. So it goes back a really long way. And it possibly originated from early traders, immigrants, and slaves through the Spanish Caribbean. And so even though it's usually prepared with a leftover ham bone from Sunday dinner and pork sausage, you know, many people who observe kashrut would substitute beef or brisket for the pork ingredients. So even if we go back to the Kosher Creole cookbook, Mildred Covert comments that there was nothing in our religion that said you couldn't eat red beans and rice on Monday, and that's what we did. So I really appreciate that line, right? Of like, we found a way of taking this tradition that is so important in New Orleans and claiming it, right? Participating in it in whichever and however we could, right? Even if we were observing kashrut, we found ways to also participate. And I think it also, as a ritual, it illustrates how food orients even the days of the week, and how food offers a means of creating order, structure, and patterns. In a lot of ways, it's not dissimilar to how Shabbat and its accompanying foods, challah, wine, chicken, right, orient the Jewish week. And Jews desire to participate that even if they didn't have a leftover ham bone from Sunday dinner. All right. Any questions or comments so far?
No.
Great. All right. So from here, I want to, you know, it's not really a season, like it is a season, like Mardi Gras season is a season in and of itself. You know, but Mardi Gras is really one of the most, you know, is an epitome of what it means to be blending religious, cultural, civic rituals into one entity, essentially, right? So it's ultimately a synthetic observance combining Catholic religious customs from Caribbean and Latin American carnival celebrations, accompanied by the African American art form of jazz. And even though it's rooted in Catholic religious holidays, Mardi Gras holds deep civic and communal meaning beyond the boundaries of religion in New Orleans. So the first, if you think about Mardi Gras, what is the first food that you think of?
King cake.
King cake, yeah, absolutely. Which is funny, right? Because king cake, what is king cake at its core?
Like a Danish.
It's like a Danish, yeah. But what is the king of king cake?
The baby.
And who's the baby? Is it just a regular baby?
It's supposed to be baby Jesus?
Yeah, it's supposed to be baby
Probably.
Jesus. Yeah, it's baby Jesus, right? So, right. So, I remember the first time I ever had king cake actually was a classmate of mine when I was in rabbinical school was from Slidell, and she grew up Catholic, and she converted to Judaism and decided to become a rabbi. And when we were in Jerusalem on Mardi Gras Day, she made a king cake for us. And
wow.
I remember she made a king cake. She had someone ship it in. I don't know. But there we are, all these rabbinical students in Jerusalem, cutting up this king cake, and someone's like, "Oh, I found baby Jesus," right? But even though it has that religious valence, right? Every time you buy, if you get the baby Jesus and you buy the next king cake, right? Even though it has that religious valence, it's still something that is so important in broad New Orleans culture, right? And also amongst Jews. And one of my favorite stories is that, I don't know if you all know this, that Dornach used to have a kosher bakery, and they used to make king cakes. But instead, because it was a kosher bakery, instead of putting in baby Jesus, they put in baby Moses, which is wonderful. And I wish that still existed. But I think it's again, a really great example of, here's this really important New Orleans ritual, right? Embodied in food that has religious undertones, but has significance beyond the religious sphere, and the Jewish community coming into conflict with some of that religious valence, right? Having a baby Jesus inside of our cake is a little bit problematic, and finding a solution so that we can still participate in this activity. Yeah, someday.
The French bakery, they put in, they don't put in baby Jesus. They put in little pottery pieces, like they could be watering cans or flowers or different things, but they don't put in an actual baby. Or they
what's so fun, when you said pottery pieces, I was thinking it was like an archaeological dig, and so it was just like like an ostrakhan or something in there. And I was like, oh, that'd be cool for like some archaeological,
kids digging through the cave.
Yeah. No, but it's a great example of how, some of the religious undertones of Mardi Gras are also coming into conflict with individuals of other, theological and philosophical backgrounds, right? Not just the Jewish community. Our next Mardi Gras food is not actually an edible food, but it's the Crude Bagel, right? So the history of the inclusion and exclusion of Jews in Mardi Gras festivities reveals how the Jewish community has been perceived in New Orleans society. So although a Jew, Louis Solomon held the honor of being the first king of one of the crews in 1872, which is a fun fact I'd like to drop all the time. By the turn of the century, Jews had been completely excluded from all Mardi Gras events. And this trend continued well into the 1960s. Despite Jews' wealth and long history in New Orleans, they were denied elite status because of their religion, but also ethnicity. And in fact, many Jews preferred to leave the city altogether during Mardi Gras. According to the research of Fishman and Zwigenhoff, Jews had still not reached that elite status into the 1980s. But then in response, right, in 1996, Crude Jew, the first Jewish Mardi Gras crew, has marched in Crude parade each and every year tossing candy and beads to the crown, along with a special Jewish treat, gold painted bagels. And it's, I mean, the bagel is an interesting, you know, it holds its own symbolic meaning, right? If you say someone's a little bit bagely, right? Like it can be, it's a way of reappropriating a food that has become identified with a group of people, sometimes in a negative context, right? But also, as we mentioned before, New Orleans has the worst bagels. And yet, the symbol of the bagel is so inherent, is so identified with Jews, admittedly Ashkenazi Jews, right? It's a very kind of Ashkenormative understanding of what it means to be Jewish and Jewish foods and things like that. But to take the bagel and make it into a Mardi Gras throw really represents this kind of reclamation of the Jewish community's space within Mardi Gras culture, and I would say therefore within New Orleans culture. And one of the books I was reading made a point, Marcy Cohen Ferris made a point to say that the bagels do not pose a physical threat since they resemble light French bread rather than a hard New York bagel.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So we'll move into the springtime. And we will start with Passover, with matzo ball gumbo. So of course, gumbo is one of the most iconic foods of Louisiana and really, you know, in so many ways embodies that idea of creolization that Spitzer articulated, right? Most accurately described as a thick soup or a thin stew seasoned with a mix of two or more types of meat, right? Gumbo represents an ideal creolized food. Fiebelman notes that, according to folklore, the French colonists brought fish stew, the Spanish added hot peppers, Africans introduced okra, the Choctaws added filet powder, and the Acadians eliminated finfish from the concoction. In the Bro manuscript, the author, a native Louisianan, refers to gumbo as the national dish of Louisianans. In a lot of ways, gumbo is kind of like cholent. Is cholent a thing in the South? Do people have cholent?
Cholent. Yeah.
Yeah.
My grandparents. My grandma made cholent.
Yeah, but
right, but it's like,
not in the South.
What was that?
She's talking about her grandparents having cholent, and they were New Yorkers, not
Right. But I think there's something about gumbo and cholent that feels very similar. Just kind of, we're going to throw a whole bunch of things into this pot and we're going to let it sit and it's going to be delicious, right?
Yeah.
And it's economical. It's an economical dish which allows the cook to both feed a large number of people with a small amount of meat.
Right, and a lot of potatoes and other things.
Mm-hmm. And to use up the small amounts of perishable meats or seafoods efficiently. Gumbo, like cholent, is a flexible dish. There are no specific ingredients or measurements, but rather it reflects the resources and tastes of Southern Louisianans at that moment in time. Same thing could go for cholent, right? When I make my cholent, I put in Coke is my secret ingredient. It gives it that kind of like sweet stickiness. But everyone has like, what was that, Rachel?
What was your secret ingredient?
Coca-Cola.
Oh.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's very good. Highly recommend.
Not diet, regular, right?
Not diet. No, because you need the sugar. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When I drink Coke, it's Diet Coke. But when I'm making cholent, it's regular Coke.
God.
Southern Jewry embraces biculturality in a way that a lot of the rest of American Jewry does not. The foodways of Southern Jews, especially dishes such as matzo ball gumbo, barbecued matzo balls, and dirty matzah, a take on dirty rice, which I've never actually seen but would love, reveal a lot about the socioeconomic and racial realities of the Jews of Louisiana. Southern Jews largely moved to the South in order to pursue careers as merchants and business owners. Southern Jews throughout history have tended to be more affluent and thus tended to have a lot in common with upper middle class white Christians, right? So this is something that makes Southern Jewry distinct from other places in the United States and the history of Jews in those spaces. That for the most part, right, overall, Jews in the Deep South were of a higher socioeconomic status. The introduction of Cajun or Creole flavors into Jewish foods often came from the African-American slaves and later servants who did most of the cooking in the home. Marcy Cohen-Ferris argues that particularly in the decades following the Civil War, Southern Jews wanted to demonstrate their civil faith, and food was central to this process, as African-American cooks in Jewish homes prepared and served traditional dishes that reinforced both the flavors as well as the racial patterns of the Old South. An analysis of Creole matzo balls reveals how Southern Jews understood their Jewish identity, their identity as both Jews and as Southerners, right? So on the one hand, the manner in which Creole matzo balls are prepared and served reflects the Southern Jewish inclination to assimilate into Southern culture and rid themselves of foodways that mark them as different, right? So the matzo ball, on the one hand, is incorporating Creole flavors in the seasoning as well as in the methods of preparation. But, and I've never actually seen this in the South, but this author notes it happening that sometimes the matzo ball will be served as a side dish. Have you ever seen that, or have you always seen a matzo ball in the soup?
I've never seen it as
No.
She
No.
says that it's something that had been encountered, and perhaps it's a, depends where you, right? Because a lot of your foodways often come from where you came from, right? So in New York, you would never see a matzo ball on the side, but perhaps there were some families who did that. But what Marcy Cohen-Ferris argues is that by placing the matzo ball on the side instead of in the soup, and serving it essentially as a side dish, it de-ethnicizes the matzo ball. So it transforms it into an American rather than a Jewish dish. By the same token, the matzo ball has not been abandoned though, right? It's still a central part of Jewish identity, even if it has been assigned new forms and meanings based upon the cultural context. Have any of you had matzo ball gumbo before?
No.
No, really? The first time I had it was at Shir Kodash.
Looks delicious.
It is delicious. Yeah, Shir Kodash had a matzo ball gumbo at Kiddush like a few years ago.
They should share their recipe.
They had this incredible chef, an African-American man who I think was using very traditional Creole spices and had been trained in Creole cooking, and really created this just amazing matzo ball gumbo. Really, really fantastic. So while we are in the springtime, we will also move to the Dobash cake. So the reason why this is, so admittedly, I always associated the Dobash cake with winter, with Christmas actually, because Nita Jones Sam's every year around Christmas time, gifts Dobash cakes to people. That's the gift that she gives, right? Instead of flowers or chocolates or, whatever, it's Dobash cake. And so, coming from outside of Louisiana, I was like, oh, this must be a Christmas time treat, right? And then later found out that no, that's not the case at all. And it just that association for me, because it was a food that I had never encountered outside of Louisiana. So I put it in the springtime because April is the anniversary of the founding of the city of New Orleans. The Dobash cake is the birthday cake of New Orleans, so I kind of placed it in the spring for that reason. But did you all know that the Dobash cake has a Jewish history?
No.
I've never even tried it. Wow.
You've never tried Dobash? Oh, it's phenomenal. It's very much only a New Orleans, Baton Rouge thing. You really can't find it anywhere else, but it is really, really good. So the Dobash cake was created by a woman named Eula Ledner. She was a second-generation Hungarian Jew, and she grew up in St. Rose, Louisiana in the early 1900s. Her passion for German baking stemmed from her Hungarian immigrant mother. And
Hungarian bakeries are the best bakeries in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a place that I used to go on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called the Hungarian Pastry Shop. And it had just the best baklava, and oh, so good. Miss that place. But Ledner, right, her grandfather was a famous chef in Hungary. And so she came from this long line of cooks and chefs and bakers. And so she decided to adapt a recipe for an Eastern European 5-layer sponge cake, frosted with chocolate buttercream in between the layers of cake and caramel slices on top. Okay, now we need to go back to being in person so we actually can eat while we have this conversation, because doing this right before lunch is also not fair. So I apologize. But it was called, so the Hungarian pastry was called the Dobash torta, named in honor of its creative, Joseph C. Dobash. And he actually, I think, created it for like a czar or for some emperor or something like that. But Ledner tried to make this recipe, right? So 5 layers of sponge cake with chocolate buttercream in between layers of caramel slices, right? So it's a lot of stuff and it's very heavy. So she realized pretty early on that that wasn't going to, that recipe wasn't going to work in the New Orleans humidity. It was just going to be too heavy and the cake would just fall in on itself. So she adapted it to be an 8-layer yellow cake with homemade chocolate custard sandwiched between each layer and topped with 2 types of chocolate frosting. Her son, Albert Ledner, recounts how she chose to change the name from Dobash, right? Dobash, however you pronounce it, to Dobash with the E-R-G-E at the end to make it sound French, right? So she takes this Eastern European cake. She fiddles with the recipe a little bit so that it works better in the New Orleans climate, and she Frenchifies it, right? She gives it a little bit of a French name, and voila, we have this cake that has become so identified with New Orleans, and it's literally called, right, the birthday cake of New Orleans, or the queen cake, right, as the kind of the opposite of the king cake, right? And it was created by a Jewish woman. So I really feel like the Dobash cake really perfectly reflects that cultural back and forth that dominates Southern Louisiana foodways, right? We have the daughter of Jewish Hungarian immigrants bringing a delicacy from her homeland, adapting it to fit both the climate as well as the cultural sensitivities of the community. And it also illuminates how Southern Jews understand their identities as both Southerners and Jews. In the Jewish Week, Beulah Ledner's daughter, Catherine, commented that everyone knew that Beulah was Jewish. She went to synagogue. She was a member of the Jewish Community Center in New Orleans. There you go, a little plug for you. But her Dobash cake is more of a New Orleans thing than a Jewish thing, right? So this kind of separation between what's Jewish and what's New Orleans, right? Even though they're constantly interacting in the mind of Beulah's daughter, they were separate, right? There's also, again, a certain amount of class and race dynamics happening here, right? Here we, as I said, Jews of the Deep South tended to be wealthier, of higher status. Historically, many Southern Jewish families were slave owners, and post-emancipation, as wealthy whites, they were seen as wealthy whites, right? And so they maintained African Americans as servants and cooks in their homes. So most of the daily cooking was done by the African American cooks, right? So the meat and potatoes dishes were often done by cooks in the home, while the women of the house had like the leisure of both time and money to be able to do things like baking, right? A baked good is a luxury at the end of the day, right? We don't need Dobash cake as much as we think that we do, right? We don't need it in order to survive. It's something that is sweet, it's a treat. Hi, Marilyn, welcome. It's meant to be something to enjoy. So while Beulah was the first generation of Eastern European immigrants, so she wasn't necessarily as secure and as a social position as someone who was a multi-generational French or German Jew, she clearly was at least middle class. Her husband owned a furniture store, and she had the time and the financial resources to bake. It's also, right, and then, right, so you have that on the one hand where the Jewish community was seen as a bit up higher class than they might have otherwise in other places in the United States at the time. But on the other hand, right, the Jewish community was still marginalized and wasn't necessarily seen as completely, part of the community. And one way that you can see that is actually in her cookbook, in Beulah Ledner's cookbook. It makes a point of saying that in addition to the wholesale business, she had the good fortune of becoming the supplier of all of the cakes for the famous Boston Club, one of the uppermost gentlemen's club in the entire United States. So the reason why that is so, profound, right, is this quote is about the early 1950s. And when I read it, I was like, okay, I guess like it makes sense to include that. But then I realized it's full of significance, right, that despite that the Jews, Judah P. Benjamin and Louis Solomon having been members of the club in the past, at the turn of the 20th century, Jews were barred from that social club, right? They were barred from the Boston Club. So for Beulah Ledner to be creating this Dobash cake that was then became identified, that was purchased by the Boston Club, and like that she was the the sole provider, shows that that was seen as something that was a means of social capital, if you will. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
Great. All right. Any other questions about Beulah Ledner and the Dobash cake? All right. Well, we'll move into the summertime. So we have to talk about crawfish. So obviously crawfish, right, is this incredibly symbolic symbol for Cajuns and has been adapted in New Orleans and Southern Louisiana overall, right? The crawfish boil itself, creating profound meaning for the Cajun community and now also for the wider New Orleans community. It's a communal event encouraging group unity, intimacy, cooperation, and connection to the land and nourishment that it provides. And even though obviously New Orleans is not a part of Acadiana, these Cajun flavors and crawfish boils have become commonplace in this area. And so, in the summer, in the late spring, Memorial Day and a little bit later, right, crawfish boils are a standard social event. It's a way of hanging out and spending time with the rest of the community. So many Louisianan Jews want to participate in this communally meaningful food event, even though kashrut laws, right, forbid crawfish, right, forbid seafood. But other Jews have embraced crawfish as a means of participating in Southern food culture. So this is like one of my favorite things of all time is the Temple Sinai seafood bingo. I don't know if does anyone know if this still happens? Anyone a member of Sinai could tell me if this is still occurring? Do we know?
I don't know.
This one was from 2018, was like the last flyer for it that I could find online. But essentially, right, the seafood bingo was a fundraiser for the synagogue that was a crawfish boil. And I've heard, I don't know if it's true, that the crawfish boil would happen like in the middle of the, not the sanctuary, but the social hall or whatever. So like actually within the synagogue. I don't know if that's true or not. But I love that idea, right? And I think a lot of people were like, oh, a synagogue that has a crawfish boil. But for, to me, it's like, no, this so perfectly embodies what it means to be a New Orleans Jew. Yeah, Marilyn.
Also, we went to a Shabbat dinner, and it was the farewell dinner for, I think, the canner that they had at the time was leaving. This was just a few years ago, and they had gumbo and bull shrimp and all sorts of stuff, and it was after it was the oneg, and I was like, oh my God, because it never occurred to me that, I mean, I knew that they didn't keep kashrut rules, but it just seemed kind of in your face to have it, as that was the feature.
Well, I think, right, so there's a couple of things happening here, right? Because it's actually more than just the encountering of New Orleans culture and Jewish culture, but it's also it also brings to light some of the tensions that exist within the Jewish community, right? If you think about the famed Treifa banquet, so in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was an ordaining class of rabbis at HEC Cincinnati that had this big banquet after ordination, and it was like filled with trace foods, right? And it became known as the Treifa banquet. It wasn't actually quite as salacious as that. It's kind of been blown out of proportion over time, but there was for a period of time, right, a pushback, a very intentional response to some of the Jewish traditions that were seen as antiquated or othering, like kashrut, right? And so it wasn't just like, oh, I'm not going to observe kashrut. It's like, I'm going to have, crawfish in the middle of the sanctuary, right? Not the sanctuary, in the middle of the synagogue, right? Or this group of brand new rabbis is going to sit and have treif for our celebration dinner. This kind of bucking of traditional understandings of kashrut. Well, if the seafood bingo still happens, I would definitely go. I think it'd be really fun. Any other questions about crawfish and seafood bingo?
I was shocked when I moved to New Orleans and heard about that.
Yeah, if you're from outside of the area and you hear about it, right, it seems like it just doesn't make any sense. You're like, what? How is that a thing? But then when you're here, you're like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Oh, I put in the chat. Isn't the crawfish the logo on the Perla shirt?
Yes, it is.
Which is kind of,
Are they a Jewish family?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I did not know that.
Absolutely.
All right, next research project. Perla's family. Right, but they want to be identified as Southern, right, as Louisiana, and so the crawfish becomes the symbol. Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. For the summertime, I also included Sazerac. So the journey of the liquor and cocktail referred to as Sazerac illustrates the continuous transfer of food culture in Louisiana. According to legend, Sazerac, a drink invented in New Orleans, was the first cocktail named after a brand of alcohol. Although this has not been substantiated, the narrative holds cultural power in the region. The journey of Sazerac begins with a French distillery in Limoges known as Sazerac de Forges Fils, which produced a brandy, which was popularized when an agent of the New Orleans distillery opened the Sazerac Coffee House in the French Quarter. I should have shown this to my partner who used to work for Sazerac House, the museum and event space, and this is what he did all day, was he just explained the history of Sazerac to people. So I probably should have just had him write this part for me. But their Creole pharmacist from Saint-Domingue named Antoine Amédée Péchaud added what's now called Péchaud's Bitters, a spicy herbal concoction created by Péchaud himself. In 1870, Thomas Handy, Schiller's bookkeeper, became the owner of the bar, renaming it Sazerac House, and substituting American rye whiskey for French brandy. At some point, absinthe was also added to the drink. Over the years, Sazerac has become an iconic drink of New Orleans and has undergone further revisions. Today, Sazerac Company, a Kentucky distillery, produces Herb Saint and Péchaud's Bitter and a rye whiskey called Sazerac. This company is now owned by the Goldring family, a prominent Jewish family in New Orleans. Throughout the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and the greater American South, one can find many institutions, both Jewish and secular, with the names Goldring and Wildenberg, including the JCC right here. Thus, the story of the creation of this single liquor has been shaped by a French company, a Creole immigrant, a bookkeeper, and a Jewish businessman, right? So it's this kind of elongated process of creolization passing through many different hands as it changes according to the individuals who hold it. So, I mean, I think it's a really fantastic example of how, this, again, like this process of creolization, that something begins in one place, encounters a different type of culture, then another group encounters it and adds their own flavor to it. And at the end of the day, we end up with this gumbo, if you will, right? And last but not least is pickling. So pickling vegetables, meats, and fruits is important in Southern foodways, particularly in the summer months. Most likely, the tradition of pickling stemmed from the overabundance of okra grown each summer in the South's warm climate. Pickling okra allowed farmers to prevent the crop from spoiling, and it also removes that sliminess that's often found in cooked okra, which is still gross. Tomatoes, also a late summer crop, are often pickled as well. And pickling can often be an important familial and community activity. As Norris points out, community groups, churches, and extended families are known to get together to make batches of pickles to share and swap. An annual family reunion or summer holiday may be a side for recreating a cherished pickle recipe. And now, what does this have anything to do with Judaism? Any thoughts?
Well, the pickle in New York is a pretty famous thing in the old time grocery stores and delis in New York.
Yeah, but what do you know? Like, why is that? Why is pickling a big thing in Jewish grocery stores and delis in New York?
I mean, I would think it goes back to Eastern Europe, where they had to pickle foods to have any type of vegetable in the winter time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's exactly that, right? So in Eastern and Central Europe, Jews had a tradition of pickling and preserving that easily meshed with the Southern tradition of summer canning and pickling, right? So even if I don't know if anyone's seen or heard about Seth Rogen's new film, An American Pickle. And it's about this man he's from, the 19th century Eastern Europe, like during the time of the pogroms. And he gets a job sweeping the floor at a pickling factory in Eastern Europe and falls into a pickle jar, like into one of the pickling barrels. And he gets preserved for like 100 years. And he finally, is released as kind of like a Honey the Circle Maker, or, something like that. And but it's that idea, he comes back to life, and he's living in 2020, and, but he's from the 19th century, and he encounters his great-great-grandson or something like that, right? But there's a reason, right? Pickling, there's the metaphor of preserving, right? But also that pickles have this resonance as being so connected to Jewish identity, both then and now. Yeah, Marilyn.
A few years ago, there was a movie called Crossing Delancey.
Oh, yes.
More than a few years ago, Marilyn, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, but the pickle man was, the hero of the story, and he was a very big deal. The whole idea of the pickles, that he used vanilla to get rid of the odor on his hands because he wanted to be modern and date this modern woman. And I mean, you don't go to a deli and get a sandwich that doesn't have a pickle on the side. That's like, what's wrong with, it's missing.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have the pickle, or it might have pickled tomatoes and other things too. But especially I remember that movie because the pickle, and he had a pickle store, and that was the big
on the
deal.
lower east side of Manhattan.
I know. I would go on trips to the Lower East Side with my religious school when I was a kid, and we would go and we would get Bialys, and we would go to Gus's Pickles, and we would get pickles. And now it's like you go down to the Lower East Side and there's none of it's there anymore, which is very sad. But yeah, but I wanted to end with pickles, right? Just, I think it's a nice way of meshing these two traditions that serve similar, right? Much like red beans and rice, right? It has a utilitarian purpose, but over time, I mean, crawfish too had a utilitarian purpose, right? It was cheap, right? They were right there. It was cheap. You could just pick them right out of the water, right? Most of a lot of our foodways have utilitarian origins that have grown into sociocultural phenomena, right? And like things that really bring us together and create moments of connection, and also enable us to interact with individuals who are outside of our own group. So, I really love looking at these things. I think so often we especially in New Orleans, where there's food everywhere and there's so many interesting things going on with food, to take a moment to stop and think about, how food, how New Orleans food and how Jewish food interact and have grown and changed, and what it says about how we understand ourselves as the Jewish community, how the outside community understands us, and where we've been and where we're going.
Sorry.
Oh, Yvonne said, I thought Gates of Prayer also had a seafood bingo when Rabbi Sher was there. I've heard that. I've yet to see any evidence, but I know a lot of times people are like, oh, Gates of Prayer, that's the one with seafood bingo. I'm like, no, that's Sinai, but maybe we also had one at some point.
Gates of Prayer did have one, and it stopped when Rabbi Lowy took over. And he explained, I was in a study group or something with him, and he explained that he thought, while he didn't keep kosher and he didn't
Marilyn, your sound popped off.
Oh, let's see.
No, I can hear her.
Okay. Well, anyway,
I can't hear you.
If the synagogue, if they served things that were
Marilyn, we can't hear you.
I can hear her.
I can hear
You can
her
hear
too.
Yeah, we can all hear her.
Oh,
well, if
this
they served things that were obviously unkosher, like shellfish, it was too confusing for the Jewish neighbors to figure out, there's this kind of Jew that keeps this and that, that was too much to explain, that we just shouldn't do it. And it became a rule when Rabbi Lowy started. So that, however, 30 something years ago, that wasn't years ago, that was a long time ago, but we did have, and I didn't belong then. I started about the time, I joined about the time Rabbi Lowy started. So I never went to one, but I know, they did have them.
Nice. I'm sorry, and I'm just seeing your comments in the chat. So thank you for those. For whatever reason, when I was sharing, they weren't popping up. It's nice to read through them now.
It's late because I went and got my COVID shot this morning.
Oh, mazel tov.
To you in the car on the way home, and then Marvin's car died, and I had to help him with the battery. So but I persevered because I thought, I'm going to make that class.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. If anyone, I'm always looking for new Jewish foods to explore in the South. So.
And I used to have that cookbook, the Creole.
The Kosher Creole.
Kosher Creole. And I either gave it to Noah or I donated a bunch of cookbooks to Jefferson Parish Library. So it might be there. What can I tell you?
Mm-hmm.
But it's good. But I had already gleaned all the substitutions that you needed for red beans and rice and the things that I wanted, And I've learned some of those from my first mother-in-law too. Hot dogs always works if you don't have sausage,
Good to know.
Hot dogs
and now there's so many vegetarian options. You can do vegan sausage, and like there's a lot. There's even more opportunities.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
That was
Glad
fun.
you enjoyed it.
I did.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.